Okay, chapter 3, the second of the three spirits. Scrooge woke up right in the middle of a snore. He needed no one to tell him that the bell was about to strike one. He awoke in the nick of time. For this time, he wished to confront the spirit the moment it appeared. He didn't want to be taken by surprise and become nervous. Scrooge was prepared for a strange appearance to occur before him. Nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have surprised him much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, Scrooge was not prepared for nothing. So when the bell struck one and no shape appeared, his body trembled. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time Scrooge lay on his bed. His bed was in the middle of a blaze of light. The light streamed upon it when the clock struck the hour. Although it was only light, Scrooge found it as alarming as a dozen ghosts, since he didn't know where the light came from. After a while, he began to wonder about the source of the light. Could it come from the adjoining room? He got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by name. It told him to enter. He obeyed. It was his own room. There was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were hung with living greens of hollies, mistletoe, and ivies. Heaped on the floor was a sort of throne made of turkeys, geese, chickens, pigs, mince pies, and sausages of all sorts. Juicy oranges, luscious pears, and bowls of punch towered high. Upon this throne sat a jolly giant. It had a glowing torch and held it up high to shed its light on Scrooge. "Come in," said the ghost. "Come in and know me better." Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the stubborn Scrooge he had been. Although the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, Scrooge didn't want to see them. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look at me." Scrooge obeyed once more. It was clothed in one simple deep green robe trimmed in white fur. On its head it wore only a holly wreath with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and flowing. It had sparkling eyes, open hands, and a cheery voice. A joyful air surrounded it. "Have you ever seen the likes of me before?" the spirit asked. "Never," said Scrooge. "Bring me where you will. I went forth last night and learned a lesson. It's working now. Tonight, if you have to teach me, let me learn from it." "Touch my robe," commanded the spirit. Scrooge did as he was told. All the food that made up the throne vanished. So did the room, the fire, and the glow. Scrooge and the spirit were now on the city streets on Christmas morning. There was music in the air as the men scraped the snow from the sidewalks. The sky was gloomy. The chimneys were as black as night. It was as if all the chimneys in Great Britain blazed away to their heart's content. There was nothing very cheerful about the town. Yet there was an air of happiness, for the people shoveling away were full of joy. They called out to one another and threw snowballs. The shops were half open. If one peered inside and saw the mountains of pears and grapes, his mouth watered. The scent of coffees and teas made one's nose grateful. The cinnamon sticks were long and straight. It was a hectic scene inside as the shoppers lost sight of their baskets and jostled about. The shopkeepers kept peace with their polished hearts. Soon the steeples called the good people to the churches and the chapels. The people flocked through the streets dressed in their finest clothes. At the same time, many people emerged from nameless streets and dark corners. They carried their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of the poor appeared to interest the spirit very much. It stood in a baker's doorway with Scrooge beside it. As the poor passed, the spirit took off the covers of their plates and sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. Scrooge noticed it was a very odd torch. When angry words passed between some dinner carriers, the spirit shed drops of water on them from the torch. Their good humor and friendly faces returned at once. Then they said it was a shame to fight on Christmas Day, and so it was. God love it, so it was. In time, the bells stopped and the baker's shutters closed. The poor smiled as they cooked their meals above each baker's oven. The pavement smoked as if the stones were cooking too. "Is there a particular flavor you sprinkle from your torch?" asked Scrooge. "There is," said the spirit. "My own." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any, but a poor one most." "Why to a poor one most?" asked Scrooge. "Because it needs it most." They moved on, invisible as before, into the suburbs of the town. Perhaps it was the generous, kind nature of the spirit and its sympathy with the poor that led them to the house of his clerk. The spirit took Scrooge right to the door of Bob Cratchit's house. You guys remember Bob Cratchit from the beginning of the story, who worked for Scrooge? It blessed the home and sprinkled water from its torch upon it. To think, the ghost of Christmas present would bless this four-room house. Mrs. Cratchit was inside preparing Christmas supper. Scrooge noticed her dress was old. Although shabby, it was adorned with new ribbons. It was a dress made with help of Belinda Cratchit, the second of her daughters. Belinda's dress also bore woven ribbons to make the dress come alive once more. Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes. He was wearing his father's shirt. It was many sizes too large for young Peter, but the size didn't matter to him. He felt honored to be dressed so fancy on this special day. The two smaller Cratchits, a boy and a girl, came running in from the cold. They said they had smelled the goose cooking as they approached. Knowing it was their goose simmering in the oven made them run home with greater speed. The young Cratchits danced around the table while Peter tended to the potatoes. Peter blew the fire until the potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid. They begged to be let out and peeled. "What has your precious father tied up?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha is late on Christmas Day by a half hour." "Martha is here, Mother," said Martha, as she appeared in the doorway. Her face glowed. "Here's Martha, Mother," cried the two young Cratchits. "Hooray! There's such a goose for us to eat, Martha." Mrs. Cratchit moved toward Martha. She kissed her cheeks a dozen times while removing her shawl and bonnet. "Why, bless your heart, my dear, you're home at last. Hurrah!" "We had so much work to finish last night," said the girl, "and we had to clear what was left for today." She kissed her mother's cheek. "It's good to be home at last." "Well," said Mrs. Cratchit, "never mind the work, so long as you are now home with us. Come and sit before the fire and get warm. May God bless you." "Look, look," shouted the two younger Cratchits. "Father's coming. Hide, Martha, hide. What a surprise you will be." They jumped up and down at the thought of this surprise. So Martha played the game. She hid as the door opened. Mr. Cratchit took off the comforter that had warmed him so. He draped it over a chair by the fire. His clothes were worn and tattered, but Mrs. Cratchit had darned and brushed them to make them look sensible. Tiny Tim sat upon his father's shoulder. He bore a small crutch and had his legs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" asked Mr. Cratchit, looking around. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming?" said Mr. Cratchit, looking sad. "Not coming on Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see her father disappointed, even if it were only a joke. She came out from behind the closet door and ran into Mr. Cratchit's arms. It was a joyous reunion. The two younger Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim into the washroom. "How did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, after Mr. Cratchit had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Mr. Cratchit. "Better than good as gold. He sits alone so much, thinking of the strangest things. Coming home, he told me that he hoped the people saw him in the church. Because he was a cripple, he hoped the people would remember who it is that makes lame beggars walk and the blind men see." Mr. Cratchit's voice cracked when he said this. He wiped away a small tear. Our boy's getting stronger and hardier by the day. Soon Tiny Tim's crutch was heard upon the floor as he joined the others around the fire. At last the dishes were set upon the table and grace was said. When the goose was sliced, the Cratchit children beat on the table with their knife handles and shouted, "Hurrah!" The goose was perfect. Applesauce and mashed potatoes rounded out the dinner. It was a small dinner, but one that filled their bellies. Soon the plates were changed out by Belinda as Mrs. Cratchit left the room. She had pudding on her mind. Only pudding. Mrs. Cratchit had spent a great deal of time fretting over the pudding. What if it's not enough? What if it's not done enough? Suppose I should break it when I turn it out. All sorts of horrors were supposed. But Mrs. Cratchit's pudding turned out fine. Better than fine. "A most wonderful pudding," said Mr. Cratchit. He thought it was one of her greatest cooking achievements to date. "I was worried I used too much flour," confessed Mrs. Cratchit. Really, it was so fine that she shouldn't have worried one bit. Everyone had something to say about the glorious pudding, but nobody dared say that it was such a small pudding for such a large family. Any Cratchit would have blushed at the mere mention of such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The dishes were cleared, the hearth was swept, and the fire was stoked. Apples and oranges were placed upon the table. A shovelful of chestnuts were heaped upon the fire. Then the Cratchit family sat around the hearth. At Mr. Cratchit's elbow stood a jug, 2 glasses, and a custard cup without a handle. The glasses were just as good as any golden goblets they could have ever had. Even better, thought Mr. Cratchit. He poured the liquid from the jug into the glasses, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Mr. Cratchit made a toast. "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us." The entire family echoed the sentiments. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. Mr. Cratchit held his withered little hand in his own. He held it tightly. It was as if he never wanted little Tim gone from his side. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live. Does he live?" "I see an empty seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner. There's a crutch without an owner as well. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," Scrooge screamed. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared. Please tell me he will be spared. He's just a young lad." The spirit spoke once more. "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, he will die. If he does die, he better do it soon and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head low when he heard his own harsh words quoted by the spirit. He was overcome with sadness, regret, and grief. Do you guys remember when he said that at the beginning? When they were asking him, if you could donate some money to the poor. And he said, and they said, but, they could die. And Scrooge said, well, if they're going to die, they better do it and decrease the surplus population. So he used his same words against him. "Man," said the ghost, "who are you to decide who shall live and who shall die? In heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child." Trembling, Scrooge bent before the spirit and cast his eyes toward the ground, but he raised them upon hearing his own name come from the lips of Bob Cratchit. "Mr. Scrooge," said Mr. Cratchit, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge. He's the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit. Her face reddened. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon. I'd hope he'd have a good appetite for it, too." "My dear," said Mr. Cratchit, "the children. It's Christmas Day." "Should be Christmas Day, I'm sure, on which one drinks to the health of such a stingy, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows his awful ways more than you. Poor fellow you are." "My dear," said Mr. Cratchit, "it's Christmas Day." "I'll drink to his health for your sake as well as the day's sake," said Mrs. Cratchit, "but not for his sake. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. There was no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank last and didn't care for the drink at all. Scrooge was the troll of the family. The mere mention of his name cast a dark shadow over the party. After 5 minutes, the festive mood returned. Mr. Cratchit brightened the mood with news that he might have found young Peter a job that paid a full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The younger Cratchits laughed when they thought of Peter as a man of business. Soon, under the crackling and popping of the chestnuts, the family started to sing Christmas carols. They sat singing as they continued to warm themselves around the fire. There was nothing truly grand about this scene. They were not a handsome family, not at all well dressed. Their clothes were tattered. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their table was often empty, but they were happy, grateful for what they did have, content with one another. When they faded from Scrooge, they looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch. At parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, especially Tiny Tim. By this time it was getting dark. The snow fell heavily as Scrooge and the Spirit walked along the streets. As they looked in windows, they could see preparations for cozy dinners taking place. No matter where the ghost walked, people felt its generous spirit. They came alive with glad tidings. Even the lamplighter, who planned to dot the dusky streets with specks of light all night long, laughed aloud as the Spirit passed him. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak moor. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live. They labor in the depths of the earth, the deepest, darkest places. But look, they know me. See?" Scrooge walked toward a light. It shone from the window of a hut. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful group. Many generations sat together, singing Christmas songs. All found a warm smile for each other as they huddled closely to stay warm. But the Spirit did not stop here. It told Scrooge to hold its robe, and they continued on. They soon found themselves out to sea. Scrooge's ears were deafened by the thundering of water. It raged and roared among the dreadful caverns it had made. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rock stood a single lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base. Storm birds rose and fell about it. But even here, 2 men who watched the light had made a fire and wished each other a Merry Christmas. The older one, with his face damaged and scarred with hard weather, sang a sturdy song of Christmas cheer. Again, the ghost and Scrooge sped on above the black heaving sea. They stopped on a ship and stood beside the helmsman at the wheel. The sea life was a rough one, yet each man had good thoughts for others this particular day. All shared in, to some extent, the festivities of the day. Each remembered someone they cared for in the distance. Every one of them was delighted and comforted to know that someone cared for them as well. Scrooge thought, how dark and lonely this life must be. Yet these men are happy. They thought only of bringing happiness to others. In an instant, he was surprised to hear a hearty laugh. He was even more surprised to find the laugh belonged to his nephew. He looked around and he found himself in the bright, gleaming room of his nephew's home. "Ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha ha! If you should happen to know a man more blessed in life than Scrooge's nephew, I should like to know him. There's nothing in the world as contagious, not even a disease, as laughter and good humor." When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides and twisting his face into strange contortions, everyone around him laughed. "He said Christmas was a humbug. Can you believe that?" cried Scrooge's nephew. "And he believed it too. He actually meant it." "More shame for him, Fred," said his wife. Scrooge took note of his niece by marriage. She was very pretty. She had the sunniest eyes he ever saw. "He's a comical old fellow," said Fred. "That's the truth. He's not as pleasant as he could be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, don't they? I have nothing to say against him, not a word." "I'm sure he's very rich," said Scrooge's niece. "At least that's what you always tell me." "What of that, my dear?" asked Fred. "His wealth is of no use to him. He doesn't do any good with it. He doesn't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't any satisfaction in thinking that he is ever going to benefit us with it." "I have no patience with him," said Scrooge's niece. All the women in the room nodded in agreement. "Oh, I have," said Fred. "I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers because of his ways? Himself, always. He takes it into his head to dislike us. He refuses to dine with us. What's the consequence? He misses a great meal and our merry moments. I gave him the same invite each year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He'll always find me in good temper going there on Christmas Eve and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the mood to leave his clerk an extra 50 pounds, that's good enough for me. I think I rattled and shook him yesterday. Now the guests roared with laughter at the thought of Scrooge being shaken and rattled about. After the fine meal, they turned to music, games, and tea. Scrooge's niece sat upon the harp and played a song. Scrooge recognized it from his childhood at the boarding school. This reminded him of the ghost of Christmas past. When the notes played, all the things that the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more. Perhaps if he had listened to more music like this years ago, he might be a kinder man now. Instead, he followed in Jacob Marley's ways. Although the guest didn't know it, Scrooge joined in on the songs and games. The ghost was greatly pleased to find Scrooge in such a happy mood. But when Scrooge begged to stay until the last guest left, the spirit told him it was not possible. The new game would be Scrooge's last, and what a game it was. It was called Yes and No. Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the guest had to guess what it was by asking questions that would be answered by only a yes or no. The questions shot out like rapid fire. Finally, the niece's sister guessed correctly. It's your Uncle Scrooge, which it certainly was. Many objected to Fred's answer of no to is it a bear, because to them he was. He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure, said Fred. It would be ungrateful not to drink to his health. He held up his mulled wine. To Uncle Scrooge. Uncle Scrooge, they all cried. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to the old man wherever he is. He wouldn't take my glad tidings, but may he have them anyway, said Fred. If only the ghost had given him time, Scrooge would have applauded the speech and thanked each one. But the whole scene passed off in the last breath spoken by Fred. The spirit and Scrooge were once again on new travels. No matter where they visited, they were always met with happy people. In hospitals, jails, street corners, it was all the same. The people's hearts were filled with happiness and gratefulness for what each had. In many cases, they had very little. When they left another party, Scrooge noticed the graying hair of the ghost. Are spirits' lives short? My life upon this globe is very short, said the spirit. It ends tonight. Tonight, cried Scrooge. Tonight at midnight, said the spirit. The time is drawing near. The chimes were ringing 11:15 at the moment. Forgive me for asking, said Scrooge, but I see something coming from under your robe. Is it a foot? A claw? The spirit answered sorrowfully. Look. It pulled its robe back slowly. From the foldings of the robe came two wretched, miserable children. They knelt at the spirit's feet and clung to its garment. They were a boy and a girl. They were ragged, yellow, meager, and scowling. Where graceful youth should have filled their faces, a stale and shriveled hand had twisted their features every which way. Scrooge stared. He was appalled. He tried to say they were fine children, but choked on the words. Spirit, are they yours? Scrooge could say no more. They are man's, said the spirit, looking down upon them. The boy is ignorance, and the girl is want. Beware of both of them. But most of all, beware of the boy. Look on his brow. The word doom is written. Unless the writing can be erased. Have they no refuge? Asked Scrooge. No one to help them? Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and didn't see it. As the last stroke rang out, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley. Lifting up his eyes, he saw a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground toward him. Okay. That is the end of chapter 3. Hopefully tomorrow we'll get to read the final chapter. trying to stop our recording
There's
here.
another chapter after that.
There is another chapter. And we might...
And that's the last chapter.
Yeah, we might have to save that one for the afternoon. I'm trying to get this recording to stop, but it's being really, really slow for some reason.
I can't believe that we read, like, all the way to 80. We were at, like, 50.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did good, didn't we? All right, so where did that ghost, while I'm trying to get this to stop, where did that ghost take Scrooge?